The Cold War is over. The grim certitude of the contest with communism has been replaced by the exuberant uncertainty of international economic competition. And the great question of this day is how to ensure security for our people at a time when change is the only constant. Make no mistake, the global economy, with all of its promise and perils, is now the central fact of life for hardworking Americans. It has enriched the lives of millions of Americans, but for too many, those same winds of change have worn away at the basis of their security. For 2 decades, most people have worked harder for less. Seemingly secure jobs have been lost. And while America, once again, is the most productive nation on earth, this productivity itself holds the seeds of further insecurity. After all, productivity means the same people can produce more, or very often that fewer people can produce more. This is the world we face. We cannot stop global change. We cannot repeal the international economic competition that is everywhere. We can only harness the energy to our benefit. Now we must recognize that the only way for a wealthy nation to grow richer is to export, to simply find new customers for the products and services it makes. That, my fellow Americans, is the decision the Congress made when they voted to ratify NAFTA.
This has been 30 years in the making. This has been a long time coming, and it ain't going anywhere soon.
Reducing the deficit will require difficult and unpleasant decisions. We must face a time of national austerity. Hard choices are necessary.
Now, why is inflation a crisis? You're an investor, you've got an environment of inflation. You expect to make 5% real in your investment, and inflation goes up to 7%. You might as well take your money around the back of the house and burn it. And that was basically what was happening in the 1970s. Also, by the 1970s, Labour's share of national income had never been higher. And it was effectively costless to move from job to job, which meant that capital lost the ability to discipline Labour, hence why Labour strikes were up and all the rest of it right across the world. Parties of the left still had real grassroots organisations, and they were connected to trade unions, and trade unions did crazy stuff like have classes for people where they would explain how the economy works and what's going on and all this sort of stuff. Even in the United States, not as quite as much as places like Sweden or Germany, but they did. And therefore there was this kind of organic connection. In the 70s, with the inflationary crisis of the 70s and the first globalization shock, which is basically Japan and South Korea, basically those industries migrated to East Asia, pushed us on top of the flight of industrial capital that you had trying to go to right-to-work states, for example, from Wisconsin to Texas and places like this. And you get that kind of first hollowing out of the Democratic coalition. Now, what is the lesson that the Democrats and New Labour in Britain, as it becomes, and the SPD in Germany take, is, right, we're going to resist this. So the first wave is resistance, and that just fails. Because in a sense, these parties are the establishment, and they've been seen to fail in some sense.
There you go again.
So the response of all this was the neoliberal revolution. Reagan and Thatcher in politics, and the whole new classical macro and economics, and theories about credibility and central banks and the importance of inflation control. And the way that the parties respond on the left is they hire technocrats. They find economists who are friendly to finance, strategists who will tell you how to win, technocrats will tell you what works and what doesn't and what policies you can choose. And you create this kind of technocratic infrastructure that only talks about policy rather than politics.
So I believe he has been a good governor. I think he's been very good for the Massachusetts economy. I think if he hadn't been, he never could have raised all the money he raised from the business community in Massachusetts. And it's that broad base that's got the Republicans worried.
Then along comes the second globalization shock for the United States, that's basically NAFTA. And then the third one, the China shock. And by that point, boom, that traditional Democratic constituency has been completely left at the same time as the Democrats have made this pivot towards basically embracing Wall Street.
Over the past 7 years, we've tried to modernize the economy, and today what we're doing is modernizing the financial services industry. tearing down these antiquated walls and granting banks significant new authority. This will, first of all, save consumers billions of dollars a year through enhanced competition. It will also protect the rights of consumers. It will guarantee that our financial system will continue to meet the needs of underserved communities, something that the Vice President and I tried to do through the empowerment zones, the enterprise communities, the community development financial institutions, but something which has been largely done through the private sector and honoring the Community Reinvestment Act. The legislation I signed today establishes the principles that as we expand the powers of banks, we will expand the reach of that act.
We built a whole new world. We reconfigured both the software and the hardware of capitalism, if you want to put it that way. But there was two bugs in the software. The first bug was when you financialize everything, when you let banks do what they do, because they've been locked up in their New Deal regulatory box for the previous 30 years, then they have a sin, and the sin is called leverage. So they will continue to make loans way past their asset security, the amount of assets they've got as security, until basically they fall over. Left on their own, without robust policies in terms of taxes and distribution, capitalism generates massive amounts of inequality. And we've seen this right across the world. In the countries that basically protected their ability to produce public goods and collect taxes, your Germans, your Swedes, etc., have far lower levels of inequality than we do. Basically, you got leverage in the banking system, which everybody has been using to borrow money to pay for the middle class lifestyle that they can no longer afford. Why? Because their wages have been stagnant since 1979. Why is that? Because inflation got squeezed out of the system and all the returns went to capital, which is the inequality skew. 2008, the whole system goes bang.
We start 2009 in the midst of a crisis unlike any we have seen in our lifetime.
And the central banks step in and basically bail out the assets and incomes of the top 20% of the income distribution everywhere. Because when you bail out the banks, you're talking about assets and liabilities again. And when you bail out banks, you're bailing out the assets and liabilities of the banks, which is my condo in Boston, some other guy's pension, somebody's portfolio of investments. And when you do that, you turn private debt into public debt, which is why there's a big spike in public debt through bailing the banks. And then you get people like Ryan who turn around and go, oh my God, look at that huge increase in debt. This is outrageous. We need to cut Social Security. So that sets up a politics whereby you've got people who have been living on borrowed time, borrowed credit, and stagnant wages for generations. Almost more than a generation, 60%, if not 70% of the US income distribution. Now, along comes a guy called Trump. And Trump walks to places that the mainstream Democrats won't even touch. They say, hey, these people that come in every 4 years and say, vote for me, hope.
Bring hope back to the American dream.
Vote for me, change.
Change has come to America.
How's that been working out for you? Because they've done shit, right? You guys, you used to have manufacturing jobs. The companies are doing well, they're doing better than ever, but basically they're all in China. And that's why the only thing that works in your town now is Walmart, because that's what happens when they import it back to you, so you can buy it with your declining wages. But don't worry, because we'll give you credit cards at usurious interest rates to make sure you can keep buying this stuff until your family goes increasingly bankrupt. And that's basically the story that Bernie on the left, and also to a certain extent Trump on the right, was telling. And that resonated with millions of people because that's true. So basically people show up and say, hey, we're back to full employment. It's an aggregate number. Nobody lives in an aggregate. Who cares, right? Your wages are stagnant. Why are you all complaining? Oh, you're a bunch of deplorables, right? You can just see this beginning to snowball.
I was thus deeply shocked and alarmed this Friday to hear my opponent attack, slander, smear, demean these wonderful, amazing people who are supporting our campaign by the millions.
Now, my favourite one for Brexit on this is months before it was going on, a couple of months before it was going on, there was a rally up in Sunderland. And now Sunderland is a place where it's a poor town in the northeast. The main employer is Nissan Automotive, and they make all these cars that get exported to Europe. So the entire British establishment links arm in arm because, of course, Europeanisation and globalisation has been very good for them, the top 10%. So they all line up, Labour, Conservative, makes no difference. You can't do this, our future lies with Europe. So they go to this place that sells shit to Europe, makes shit for Europe. And you think, well, come on, honestly, these guys will understand, right? And then this guy stands up and says, you realise, of course, there'll be a huge loss of GDP if we leave Europe. And one of the guys who makes the car shouts out, your GDP That guy understands the distributional effects of capitalism better than you do. If there's GDP growth, it's going to go into London. It's going to go to the people who already have assets. Every contract he's signing, he's working longer hours. He's getting more squeezed. He's getting monitored for his pee breaks. Oh, you have to stay in this. This is awesome. Well, it might be awesome for you, but it's not awesome for him. Once you figure out that this is the common story, particularly across the kind of Anglo-Saxon developed world, the European story is slightly different because of the neuralgia over migration in particular. But you've got basically stagnant incomes, life chances have been shredded, 20% of people have made off with 80% of the returns. Within that 20%, 20% of the 20% have really made off with 60% of everything. Astonishing levels of inequality. And basically, people are broke and they've had enough and they don't believe a word anyone's saying anymore. So once you tap into that as a 30-year structural story, you kind of get why where we are. And you also get why this is the way things are. This is the new normal. Deal with it. The Democrats, the mainstream Democrats, they're dead. They don't even realize it yet. It's like the German Social Democrats. They're signing their own death warrant by continuing to support policies which have eviscerated their support and impoverished their supporters. And until they recognize that, there's nothing left for them.